That's President Trump live in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Here now with reaction to the president's speech, Fox News contributor Ari Fleischer, former Trump campaign deputy comms director Caroline Sunshine, and Fox News contributor Joe Concha. Great to see all three of you. You know, Ari, I was really struck by, he talked a lot about the inflation number, and it was kind of funny when that number came out, watching a lot of the press report 2.7. It's dramatically lower than anybody expected and very good news. And obviously, he is having fun playing that up as much as he can now.
Yeah, and he deserves to. 2.7% is a strong number for inflation's growth. And what's going to happen next, and this is where the future of the Trump presidency and whether Republicans can keep the House is going to come into play, is all the data that comes in over the next several months. He set the table well with his big speech the other night to the nation in which he said the economy's booming. Now people need to see that the proof is in the pudding. They need to see that the data that follows is real when it comes to wages up and inflation's down.
Yeah, people have to feel it. You know, Caroline, he was talking about just there in North Carolina, that North Carolina over the past 11 months has seen 53,000 jobs in North Carolina alone, 8,000 of those in construction, 150,000 North Carolinians lifted off of food stamps. And he made the very important point that 100% of the jobs that have been created in his administration are all private sector jobs. These are not public sector jobs.
That's right. And not only that, I would imagine there's a lot of soldiers in the audience tonight because North Carolina is home to the fourth largest military population in our country. And those warrior dividend checks that President Trump talked about just 2 nights ago, those are already hitting into the accounts of soldiers. You're seeing on social media soldiers posting that they're already getting the checks. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's also soldiers in the crowd tonight who have received those checks. But you know what President Trump said is true. He inherited a mess and he's fixing it. But he didn't just inherit the mess of Joe Biden. Yes, he is bringing down, egg prices. He's bringing down the cost of gas, making us energy dominant. But he's also cleaning up the mess of his predecessors from the last 25 years. That is the original message that he campaigned and won on. He is draining the swamp. He is making America great again. Because he's picking all the tough fights that a lot of his predecessors of the last 25 years either started or completely neglected to engage on. Look at what he's doing with China, rebalancing our trade relationship, getting to the point where tariffs now are going to potentially replace the federal income tax in the last few years. He's looking at the Middle East going, how can we waste less of our money over there on endless wars no American wants and bring their money instead here to invest here, to create American jobs here. Look at what he's doing on illegal immigration. When you deport the millions of illegal immigrants that we've seen President Trump and his administration deport in record time this year, you help raise the wages of Americans because it's a myth that Americans don't want to do the landscaping jobs. They don't want to do those jobs for $4 an hour, but they want to do those jobs. And there was a time in this country where they didn't have to compete with people doing those jobs for $4 an hour. And that's part of what he's doing. It's not just cleaning up the mess of 46. It's the mess of 44, 43, 42, frankly.
You know, Joe, Caroline makes a very good point about, President Trump has taken on these enormous goals, and he's accomplishing a lot of them far faster than I think anybody could possibly have predicted. And one of those things is, not only are the inflation numbers good with that coming down, but the idea that you can get wages increasing at a higher faster than inflation is growing. The whole thing, it's all, everything that President Trump is bringing to the table is a giant gamble. At the end of the day, if it doesn't pay off for regular consumers, then it's going to be a tough sled for Republicans in the midterms.
Oh, yeah, Charlie. I mean, the tariff bet is the biggest bet of Donald Trump's career, whether we're talking about in the private sector or as president. And at this point, it appears, because remember, when we first heard about the tariff war in early April, we were told that there was going to be a recession, a stock market crash. Instead, now, what do we see today, for example? The stock market is above 48,000, heading towards 50,000. So the tariff war, as far as Trump engaging it, did not hurt the economy the way many people said it would. And then you look at all the accomplishments. Now, that's what 2026 is about, selling what happened in 2025 and what's going to happen in 2026 in terms of gas prices being at a 5-year low, in terms of the border essentially being closed despite no legislation, comprehensive immigration reform that we were told had to be passed in order to actually seal the border. No, we just need the right rhetoric and the right president. So that's a huge deal as well. All the deportations of illegal people here, violent criminals, that's a big deal as well. The Iran bombing, as far as Fordo, the U.S. carrying that out, eliminating their nuclear facilities. That was a very big deal without one loss of life on the U.S. side. I could go on and on, Charlie, but at this point, 2026 is all about how will the economy perform, and with the Trump tax cuts being permanent and with no tax on tips coming into play and everything else from the big, beautiful bill, Democrats can't just say Donald Trump bad, resist him, save democracy. They're going to need a plan, because if Donald Trump is delivering on his plan in terms of the economy, they're going to have a big, big problem in November of 2026.
And of course, as you all point out, the big problem for Democrats is they still you can blame them for so many of the problems that got us into this. Thank you each for joining us tonight.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.